Yes.
Professor Keel, I wanted to ask you next about a separate topic, the issue of better blood transfusion and clinical practice relating to the use of blood and blood components. If we pick it up at DHNI 5013_052, this is a document dated the 2nd of July 2001 from Mike McGovern, who was in the Department of Health in London. We can see who it's addressed to on the left-hand side, so I think that's a range of CMOs or DCMOs. And page 4, we don't need to go to it, but shows that you were copied in on this document. It's headed Better Blood Transfusion, note of meeting with UK CMOs. We met with you last week to discuss and plan the arrangements for the second Better Blood Transfusion Conference, now set for the 29th of October 2001. If we just go to this paragraph 2 under the heading discussion, the first sentence refers to what that day is going to focus on, and then picking it up in the third line of paragraph 2, despite work over the last 3 years, local audits still suggest that the use of blood components remains highly variable between clinicians and hospitals and needs to be explored as a marker of surgical/clinical practice. Most importantly, and in the aftermath of the recent HCV ruling, and that's obviously a reference to Mr. Justice Burton's judgment, the risk of blood transfusion would need to be recognised up front and put in clear perspective for the public, patients and clinicians. And then paragraph 3, the main issue therefore was about risk, scoping the risk of receiving blood components risk against effectiveness, communicating this to patients and the service in the context of the benefits, and reducing the risk through best clinical practice. This approach would require a full and honest partnership between the blood services and the public. It would need to be based on an agreed recognition of the risks, a policy that did not promote blood transfusion as safe and fully governed by informed consent. And then paragraph 4, just the first sentence, the overall purpose of the day would be to publicise a new, open, upfront partnership between the UK NHS blood services and the public. Now, before we look at what happened following on from this discussion, and in particular the second Better Blood Transfusion Conference, what can you tell us about any steps taken by SHHD in the 1990s to promote the better or safer use of blood and blood components?
Well, I recall that Brian McClelland and I, he was a consultant with SNBTS based in Edinburgh. We co-edited a report which came from CRAG, the Clinical Resource and Audit Group, which was a predecessor of the Clinical Standards Board for Scotland, on optimal use of blood. Now, unfortunately, I haven't revisited that report for years. I think it came out in the mid-90s, and it was very much focused on reducing inappropriate use of blood and blood components. So that is one piece of work that was government sponsored and would have been publicised through the boards.
In paragraph 2 of this minute, which I referred to, Dr. McGovern says that local audits still suggest that a highly variable use of blood components as between clinicians and hospitals. Was that the case in Scotland as well as the rest of the United Kingdom? There was still a problem here about the way in which blood and blood components were being used?
Indeed, yes.
And then the other matter which this touches on in the passages which I read out is the importance of ensuring a clear and common understanding about the risks of blood transfusion. And that might suggest that there had not been such an understanding, a public understanding at least previously. Again, would it be fair to say that that was as applicable to Scotland as it was to the rest of the United Kingdom?
Yes, it would be.
Can I then just ask you to look at a couple of documents then which post-date the Better Blood Transfusion Conference referred to here? SCGV 5096_014. This is a minute from you to Mr. Stock, dated the 28th of June 2002, and it's obviously in anticipation of a meeting of the MSBT. We don't need to look at most of the material. If we just go to the third page, we can see the last paragraph is headed Better Blood Transfusion, and it says apparently the HSC on this is to issue during the first week in July. That's Health Service Circular, I assume. Clearly, we will have to think about producing a Scottish equivalent, which hopefully will be able to point to proper funding for the effective use of blood project. Now, I'll show you in a minute the circular that was produced in Scotland, but can you assist us in understanding the reference to the effective use of blood project and proper funding for that project? What was that?
What ultimately transpired was a Better Blood Transfusion programme, which needed a programme manager and people to implement its recommendations in the service. So clearly funding would be needed because this was additional work for the service. So I can't remember whether that funding was ultimately found from within the SNBTS allocation or whether additional funding was provided from the centre for the project, but I suspect it was the former. But whatever the funding mechanism was clearly identified as a need and found.
And then just to complete the picture in relation to the Health Service Circular, SCGV 5098_179. This is towards the middle of the following year. We can see the date 19th of May 2003, and it's issued by the Scottish Executive. We look down the right-hand side, bottom half of the page, it says General Inquiries to Dr. Aileen Keel, Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And then we can see the text of it. Dear colleague, Better Blood Transfusion Programme, availability of imported fresh frozen plasma from SNBTS, and then 3 SNBTS information leaflets on blood products. And the second of those obviously is in relation to VCJD risks. But the first paragraph refers to an annex providing details of the Better Blood Transfusion programme now being progressed across NHS Scotland. I'm not proposing to go to any further documentation, but can you tell us in very general terms the kind of steps that were taken in Scotland in relation to the Better Blood Transfusion programme at this time?
Yes. Well, as I say, a proper programme was set out, programme manager appointed, and I say in my written submission, I recall him as a very energetic and effective programme manager, and reporting to him, there were 18 nurses appointed throughout the country to lead small teams within the hospitals to spread the word about the need for more appropriate use of blood and blood products. We also established a steering group, which was chaired by a cardiac surgeon actually from Aberdeen, which oversaw the programme over a period of years.
for the benefit of others, I won't take time going to it, but there's a newsletter from the Better Blood Transfusion Programme towards the end of 2003, which gives some details of the programme, and it's at SCGV 4098_124. Professor Keel, you'd been obviously working in the field of haematology clinically throughout the 1980s. Do you have any recollection on reflection on clinical practice in relation to the use of blood and blood products during that time, in the context of the kind of issues then later explored through the effective use of blood project and the Better Blood Transfusion Programme?
Yes, I think broadly the perception of blood amongst non-specialists was that it was a very safe product. And of course it was and is, but not 100% safe, as this inquiry knows very, very well. But amongst clinicians, I think the perception in general was that it was an entirely safe thing to do to transfuse a patient. So, for example, in contrast to today's practice, patients would often be topped up following surgery in a way that wouldn't be done now unless the hemoglobin level had really fallen much lower than the trigger points used in those days. So perceptions amongst the general clinical professionals have changed radically over the last 20 or 30 years. When I was training and practicing as a junior doctor, blood was used much more widely, particularly in the area of surgery, or even, for example, patients coming in to the general medical wards with anemia. I mean, nowadays we would withhold blood. We'd identify the cause of the anemia, treat it, and only if the hemoglobin was very low would blood transfusion be used as a means of getting it up.
I'm going to turn now to the issue of VCJD. Now, you were provided with a lot of documents that, in relation to VCJD, and you referred to a significant number of them in your statement. And I'm not going to take time going through those, not least because in terms of the national UK-wide picture in relation to VCJD, the inquiry has also already received quite a lot of evidence. I just want to ask you about really a couple of issues. The first arises from your statement WITN 5736003, page 27. And it's the bottom half of the page. You were asked a question at question 50 about an MSBT meeting, in fact a meeting that you were not at, and advice from Professor Kennedy that recipients of blood from a CJD patient should not be informed. And you were asked your view, and you say this, you weren't at that meeting, as far as you can remember, you were unaware of Professor Kennedy's advice until reading the minutes. But then you say this, I agreed with his view. It seemed to me that telling individuals that they might be at risk of an infection which had a universally fatal outcome, but no diagnostic test and certainly no treatment would not be the right thing to do. Now, set against that might be the idea that that's, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but a paternalistic approach. There's the patient's right to know, issues of autonomy. To what extent was that weighed as part of your thinking or the thinking of your colleagues at this time in the late 1990s? Do you have any recollection of that?
Well, I think the way that I thought about it, and I think I was not alone by any means in this view, is that the patient's right to know, which is extremely important, nonetheless needs to be set in context. What we were talking about here was an absolutely devastating diagnosis for anybody to be given. Universally fatal, no diagnostic test apart from treatment. And what we were dealing with in the context of blood transfusion was a highly theoretical risk. The evidence here was, well, there was no evidence. It was a theory that blood transfusion might be a means of transmitting the variant CJD organism. So against that background, I agreed with Ian Kennedy's advice that you shouldn't be burdening individuals with the worry, concern, those aren't adequate words. I mean, I can imagine myself being given the news I'd received an implicated blood donation. It would have been one of great distress. So that was the thinking behind my views and obviously Ian Kennedy's views.
Now, we know that as matters proceeded, there were certain notification exercises, as I think they've been termed elsewhere. Again, I'm not proposing to go through the detail of them. Some of the documentation is referred to in your statement, and the inquiry has a wealth of information on that issue. But do you, again, recall your own views as time went on about some categories of patients, at least, in due course, being notified of the possibility of having received implicated products? In other words, did your views change?
Well, I think you may be referring to a question that I was asked further on in this statement around the names of individuals being on a central registry without their consent. It seems to me, as in so many other areas related to blood transfusion, the thinking evolved over a period of time between 1996, when variant CJD was first identified, through the following decade or so. And part of that thinking evolution was thinking around the ethics of retaining data centrally on individuals who had received implicated products and whether that was the right thing to do or not. And I think my thinking was along the lines of they should at least be given the opportunity to know more about the situation.
Can we turn to the next page? And this is a slightly different topic in relation to VCJD. We can pick it up in the bottom half of the page. So we can see in that first paragraph on screen reference to plans in relation to the introduction of leukodepletion of blood donations, and then in 1999 the use of UK plasma in the manufacture of blood products being abandoned. And then you say this: in December 1997, a policy of withdrawal/recall of blood components and tissues in patients who've gone on to develop VCJD was instituted. Over subsequent years, additional precautionary measures were introduced, including deferral of previously transfused donors in 2004. Now, you've referred there to precautionary measures, and certainly that's the concept that appears throughout a lot of the documentation relating to the decision-making regarding VCJD. in the material that you've been supplied with. Did you, at the time, as far as you can recall, have any particular views about whether the precautionary approach in introducing the kind of measures that you've referred to here, whether that was the right approach or whether too precautionary an approach was being adopted?
I certainly supported a precautionary approach, but I do think that the risks, such as they were perceived as greater, for example, in relation to whole blood and blood components than to fractionated blood products. An argument comes to mind, I think, as part of the raft of measures to abandon use of UK plasma, of which albumin is a product and a very frequently used product in the NHS. The suggestion was that we should stop using UK-sourced albumin. Now, albumin has, because of the way it's manufactured, an incredibly safe track record, had never been known to transmit anything in the way of viruses or other infections. So I felt that the precautionary principle was entirely appropriate in relation to whole blood and blood components, but perhaps could be more nuanced in relation to fractionated products.
And is it right to understand from the documentation that there was a particular concern in Scotland about the implications of this raft of precautionary measures for the future of the PFC? And from time to time, it appears those concerns were voiced with you and you were asked to raise them, albeit, as I understand it, decision-making effectively was on a UK-wide basis, so Scotland didn't take in practice a different course. But was that an issue that you recall coming to the fore at all?
I don't recall ever being concerned about the future of the PFC. Certainly, in the light of the ban on UK plasma, its operations had to change radically, but it was still fractionating plasma, albeit from abroad. So I don't think, in my memory, there was ever any real doubt as to the future of the PFC, and that would not anyway, or should not anyway, have stood in any way in the path of precautionary measures.
The last issue in relation to VCJD I wanted to ask you about is this. The inquiry's heard evidence from individuals who had been informed about that they may be at risk having received an implicated product, experiencing difficulties in accessing medical and surgical treatment, being put to the bottom of lists, issues relating to the sourcing of surgical equipment for the purposes of medical procedures and the like. And I should say that's not specific to Scotland. That, again, appears to have been a concern UK-wide. Were you aware of that difficulty, and do you know whether any particular steps were taken by the Scottish Executive to try and address that problem?
Well, I was very aware of the issues arising from the need to manage patients who were considered at risk of variant CJD because they'd had human growth hormone treatment or dura mater patch or whatever. There was really a dual system set up to deal with them in terms of surgery, in that special surgical sets were used for those patients, clearly identified and sent for sterilization separately. There was a greatly increased emphasis on use of single-use instruments, disposable instruments, rather than re-sterilization. Because even the sterilization processes were certainly not from the beginning adequate to get rid of the prion protein that was associated with VCJD transmission. So in parallel with all that was happening in hospitals, there was loads and loads of research going on in terms of decontamination of surgical instruments. So it certainly added to the operational burden on the NHS, having to manage these patients in very specific and in a way that enhanced the safety of the whole system.
I'm going to move now to a separate topic, which is the question of public inquiries. It's right, I think, to understand that throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, the policy of the Scottish Home and Health Department, continued by the Scottish Executive, was that there should not be a public inquiry into the circumstances by which people had come to be infected through blood and blood products. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And what was your understanding, in broad terms, of the reasoning for that maintenance of that line?
I think in the main that there had been examination in various fora, including the internal departmental report that we talked about earlier. There had been examination of the issues in some depth, and that no new evidence had emerged which ministers felt merited a public inquiry.
It could be said that there's a degree of circularity to that position, because it may only be through the holding of a public inquiry with its powers to call for evidence from a wide range of sources and scrutinise it, that such evidence might come to light. Do you have any observation on that?
But of course, you're right. It could be that additional information would have emerged in the course of a public inquiry, but the view held at that point was that it wouldn't be appropriate because the evidence as available at the time that the calls for public inquiries were being generated had been examined, and that it would only be if additional evidence emerged that a public inquiry might augment, improve or enhance that evidence gathering.
Leaving aside the internal investigation that we looked at before lunch, in what other ways had these issues been examined in Scotland?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
So you referred to there having been examination in various fora, including the internal departmental report, and you said there'd been an examination of the issues in some depth. If we leave aside the internal investigation report, because of course that had a very specific scope, what other fora do you have in mind in giving that evidence?
Well, I suppose there's reference in an earlier document, which I think you called up to DH having looked at such issues over the years. You know, the advisory committee structure, ACBSB, latterly MSBT, had also examined, well, had looked at all of the issues over the years. So I think that's what I had in mind. But obviously, the internal inquiry on the specific issue of factor 8 safety had gone into that in some detail.
And then if we look at DHSC 00411159_205. This is an internal Department of Health minute, not copied to you, dated the 20th of May 2006, and it's from Gerard Hetherington. I just want to ask you about something on the second page, which refers to you. So if we look at the bottom of the second page, we have the heading Demand for a Public Inquiry. Ministers pointed out that demands for a public inquiry were intensifying. MSPH, so that's the Minister of State for Public Health in England, was particularly concerned that this issue should not be forced in England because of decisions in Scotland. We have consulted Dr. Aileen Keel, DCMO in Scotland. Advice from SE officials to Scottish ministers continues to be very strongly against holding a public inquiry. The executive is examining the validity of a vote in the Scottish Parliament Health Committee in support of a public inquiry. It's understood that the casting vote of the chairman may be disallowed. First of all, do you know anything about that latter issue there, about the voting issue?
No, I don't.
It is, I think, clear from this document that as at mid-2006, the Scottish executive position and your own views on the issue remained the same, strongly or very strongly against holding a public inquiry. Is that fair?
Yes.
Was the question of holding a public inquiry at this time or any earlier time ever looked at from the perspective of wanting to understand how it could be that so many people were infected and dying or had died? In other words, did the sheer scale of what had happened not give rise to sufficient public concern to justify the establishment of an inquiry?
I don't know what the criteria are for setting up public inquiries, but I guess maybe scale of problem might be one of them. But again, I'm not sure that the scale of the issue here, while of course absolutely horrendous for those who contracted viruses through blood products, I'm not sure that I agree that it was on a massive scale.
We know, of course, that in due course in Scotland, the Penrose Inquiry was instituted, and we saw yesterday that you'd given evidence to the Penrose Inquiry. Did you have any role in giving advice as to in the decision-making process that led up to the decision to establish that inquiry?
Well,
as far as you can recall.
Can't recall clearly, but I'm sure my advice would have been sought.
I don't think we've got any particular documentation that answers that or provides any further information in regard to that. Once the inquiry, the Penrose Inquiry, was established and up and running, obviously you gave evidence, as we saw, on the issue of look back. Did you have any other role in relation to the inquiry in the course of it, in terms of giving advice on matters related to the inquiry?
Not that I recollect.
One of the issues that's been explored with other witnesses is the difficulties that might arise if a body that might itself be criticised, if there were to be a public inquiry, is the body charged with deciding if there should be a public inquiry. And an issue that's been explored with other witnesses is whether there should be an independent body or independent position that might be able to either take the decision as to whether there should be a public inquiry or provide advice, at least in that regard. Do you have any views on that suggestion?
Well, I haven't thought about it before now, but I guess that such a body would have to drop the criteria that I mentioned earlier around what would trigger a public inquiry. So I suppose there might be some benefit in that.
Just a couple of then of miscellaneous issues. I don't mean to undermine their importance by describing them in those terms, that I wanted to ask you about now. If we go, please, to SCGV 40246_051. This is a minute from you, 18th of June 2001, to the Chief Medical Officer. It's triggered by, again, I think the Burton judgment, but I'm not going to ask you about that case itself. But paragraph 1 says, as you can see from the attached, I raised the issue of the possible need for a public education campaign arising from this judgment. And then if we go to paragraph 3, I think I'm fairly clear in my own mind that while public education campaigns will not remove liability in such cases, they may well reduce it. In any case, such a policy is consistent with the trend towards greater openness in general in the NHS. And I wanted to ask you about that general issue that you referred to there, the trend towards greater openness in the NHS. Now, that might suggest that there had not previously been as much openness in the NHS as perhaps there could or should be. Would that be a fair inference to draw?
Yes, I think the NHS, in, let's say, the first 50 years of its existence, was a thing of its time. Society was much less open in those days than it is nowadays. So the NHS was simply a reflection of society. Our thinking, as I said a while ago, of course, it has evolved immensely over the decades. You used the word paternalistic in reference to a comment that had been made earlier by somebody, I think a non-medic, but you know, the medical profession is often accused of paternalism. And I think that probably, well, not probably, definitely in years gone by, led to a lack of openness with the patient about what exactly, you know, was happening. And certainly it's only in, I would say, the last 20 years or so that we've begun to talk about coming to joint decisions with the patient rather than the doctor handing down on high to the patient what is going to be done. Now, I think that is exactly the way things should be, but nonetheless, it is still not an infrequent occurrence that a doctor will have a conversation with a patient and say, well, we could do course A or course B. What do you think? And for the patient to turn around and say, doctor, you know best, so you decide. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that having the conversation, giving the patient the option to share more fully in the implications of their diagnosis and what treatment or treatments are on offer is absolutely the right thing to do. So I think that this comment here about more openness in general in the NHS and that trend is just consistent with the trend in general society.
And the next topic I wanted to ask you about relates to documentation and issues about what files were retained and by whom. I don't know whether you're going to be able to cast much light on the issue in light of the limited material available, but I just want to ask you about it. If we go first of all to SCGV 40/170_150, please. So this is from you to Mrs. Towers, 24th of September 1999. And so in terms of timing, it's whilst the internal investigation is ongoing. And you say this: in the course of our investigations in this area, it has emerged that Professor John Cash took with him on his retirement some files which may be relevant, which he's gifted to the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. Both Angus Macmillan Douglas and I have tried without success to persuade him that it would be much more convenient to allow SNBTS and departmental staff access to the files in another location, e.g. St Andrew's House. Professor Cash is extremely resistant to this idea for reasons best known to himself. In the course of our conversation, he actually said to me that the files now belong to the college. I said I didn't see how that could be, but I would seek your advice on the question of ownership. Now, we saw from a document that we looked at earlier that obviously some files from Professor Cash did become available because we saw Christine Dora's comments on them. But what, if anything, do you recall about the issue thrown up by this minute, the documentation that had been retained by Professor Cash and your ability to access that?
Now, at the risk of sounding flippant, what it really reminds me of is John Cash's desire always to be mysterious and to hold in his ownership something that others don't know about. And I think the files are an example of that. Again, my recollection, although it's hazy, is that the files actually, when we finally got our hands on them, added nothing to the sum total of knowledge here. But of course, we had to try and get hold of them. And actually, it should have been much more straightforward than it was, because the files did not belong to Professor Cash. They were not in his gift to give to the College of Physicians, and he should just have handed them over to us.
As I say, I think it's right to understand from later documents. I don't think we need to put them on screen, but I'll just read an example into the transcript. SCGV 40/173_044. That there were then files handed over by Professor Cash, which were looked at in the course of the investigation. Then I'd asked you earlier about your involvement in the Penrose Inquiry. When the Penrose final report was produced, I think you were still just the acting Chief Medical Officer. April 2015 was when you ended that role. Were you involved in advising the Scottish Government about the inquiry report and its one recommendation and how that should be implemented, as far as you can recall?
Yes, I think I was before I moved out of government.
And in broad terms, do you recall the nature of the advice that you provided in relation to the Penrose Inquiry report?
Well, the only thing that sticks in my mind is the one recommendation, and the advice would have been that was already or had already been implemented, i.e. the offering of an HCV test to anyone who is concerned that they may have contracted the virus through blood transfusion.
And two final questions, Professor Keel, from me. The first is this: during the time you worked in your governmental position, so from 1992 through to 2015. Was any assessment ever undertaken by the Scottish Home and Health Department, Scottish Executive, Scottish Government, into the needs of the infected and affected communities in Scotland?
I'm not absolutely sure. However, needs assessments were conducted by various other agencies, if you like. For example, Health Protection Scotland, and other bits of CSA did conduct needs assessment. However, I can't be confident that the needs of those affected by this virus were part of that collective endeavour. However, I do recall that in terms of practical support, short of providing financial support, that we did engage with the ABPI over the difficulty that some individuals with hepatitis C were encountering in relation to life insurance and mortgages. And I know that we also explored with the NHS their access to whatever treatments it would be interferon at the beginning were available to treat the condition.
And then, Professor Keel, looking back now, is there any aspect of the Scottish Government's response to those infected and affected that you consider was misjudged or wrong?
Well, notwithstanding the existence of this inquiry, and certainly notwithstanding the or the financial support that has been provided for these patients, and fully recognising the fact that they have been through significant physical and mental problems arising from their infection, I still believe that the logic here would have been not to set up a financial assistance scheme specifically for this group of patients, because it elevated their problems to a higher level than many other groups were pursuing, equally justifiably seeking compensation for other ills that the NHS allegedly had inflicted on them. I didn't see the logic in that. And in terms of public inquiries, well, I hope this one will indeed shed further light on the issues. But at the time that the public inquiry was being resisted in Scotland, I believed, and I still believe, that at that stage, no additional evidence had emerged that would have merited a public inquiry. And therefore, I think that at that stage anyway, it would not have been appropriate for Scotland.
Those are the questions I'm proposing to ask Professor Keel, sir. But we obviously need to give an opportunity to core participants through their legal representatives to suggest any further lines of questioning. Could I ask that we take a slightly longer break, having finished earlier than our normal break time? Could we take 45 minutes?
Yes, certainly. Let me explain the those who are participating in the inquiry have a right through their recognised legal representatives to put questions through counsel to you. Plainly, they have to be given an opportunity to formulate those questions in the light of everything that you've said. And since you have only just finished, they have to be given time to do that. I don't know how long that will be. I don't know how many questions there will be, but your evidence has been of such interest. I wouldn't be surprised if there are quite a lot. We'll find out. But we won't sit again until 20 to 4. We may not sit then if there are questions coming in still or questions coming in late. So we won't sit before 20 to 4. In other words, you're free completely till then. And then I can't tell you how long you'll be detained after that. It depends how long it takes for the various issues raised by the questions to be properly ventilated. But that's what we'll do, 20 to 4, not before 20 to 4. You'll be told, of course, if it's going to be any later.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.